continue to struggle to ensure that we are noticed, that people are aware of our existence, and because that hasn't really been the case here, I think, in most universities. And I think it's important if we're talking about diversity, we're talking about race in this discussion, that American Indians are included in every discussion and included in every way, because we do have a perspective that is unique to these discussions, to this school, to this institution. How am I doing with time? Am I done? Okay, well, I'm done. So, Ahyehi, which means thank you, Agone, and Nishanigo Nanina, which means walk in beauty. And I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
So I wanted to, we're going to take questions at the end, so just hold your questions if possible till the last 20 minutes or so. I want to introduce Kelly Knapp. She's a third-year student in the CRS specialization in the program in Public Interest Law and Policy. She came to law school to become a prisoner's rights lawyer, and she hopes to land a job in helping to ensure the humane and just treatment of the incarcerated. Before coming to law school, she worked as a case manager for mentally ill inmates in the San Francisco County Jail for 3 years. During law school, she's interned with the ACLU of Southern California, Protection and Advocacy, the Los Angeles County Public Defender's Office, and the California Parole Advocacy Program.
So what I want to talk about is how my experiences in New Orleans, both before and after Katrina, influenced my CRS paper, a little bit about the paper, and then presenting the paper in New Orleans last fall. When I transferred to Tulane University as an undergrad, I had grown up in Nebraska, and I had done my first 2 years at the University of Utah. So arriving in New Orleans, race was sort of dropped on me like a bomb, I guess is the best description. From things as simple as driving around the city, where you see things like Robert E. Lee memorialized off in the distance, 50 feet up, arms crossed, facing north, because the Yankees might come again, as they say, to things like, it was my first experience being the only white person in a room. I was volunteering in the public schools, which were almost entirely black because the white kids went to private schools or lived in the suburbs, and I volunteered in the prisons, where I was where everyone else around me was African American. So race was in my face for the first time, and I didn't really have an outlet or an opportunity to talk to anyone about it. I was going to Tulane, which is primarily white students from the East Coast, wealthy, who weren't interested in talking about it, or they had their colorblind glasses on big time. But at the same time that this was going on, I absolutely fell in love with the city, with the culture, the people, the music, the joie de vivre, the hot, sweaty nights, everything. New Orleans sort of infiltrated me like it does many people and became a part of me and an important part of who I am. So when Katrina happened, like everyone else, I was glued to the media, to the TV, and I'd never felt so angry and helpless and grief-stricken at any other event. After any other national event. And I also couldn't help but notice, like most of the nation, that the faces of despair that we were looking at were primarily African American. And I think that it was a moment in our national consciousness where, and it was brief, where we were going to acknowledge that racism still exists, institutionalized racism, implicit bias. There was a moment, but it closed very quickly, I think within days, and it became this, it's class, not race theory. So I needed to get to New Orleans, just both for my social justice urges and my mental health, because I was going crazy here doing nothing. So I was one of the first students, or one of the members of the first group that went to New Orleans in January, and I volunteered with the Innocence Project New Orleans. But one of the things that was very striking to me when I was there is this stance taken by the locals, and I should say the locals who were left in the city at that time, who were primarily white. And it was a stance of fierce defensiveness, defend New Orleans, and there were even T-shirts printed that said defend New Orleans. And it was, the racism doesn't exist. This had nothing to do with race. This was a class issue. And it just being in the city before Katrina, and then at that point, that was an absurdity. The things that the city was doing, like choosing to bulldoze without notice homes in the lower Ninth Ward, which is an over 90% African-American community that's vibrant and deep historical roots and strong, but the city viewed it as blighted and full of violence and crime-ridden, and they chose that neighborhood first. And even though there were homes that needed to be demolished all over the city. I met and spent a lot of time with this gentleman here on the left named Rick Mathieu. He was a member of a group of men who, in those days after the storm, were rescuing people on boats, and this group was some of the only people rescuing in certain neighborhoods that the rescuers wouldn't go into. And he touched me deeply, his stories. I can't even go into that. But one of the things that he was talking about is that how much of the African American community, at least in his neighborhoods, believed sincerely in their heart of hearts that those debt levies were intentionally dynamited to save the economically viable or the white neighborhoods, frankly, and sacrificing the black neighborhoods. And it wasn't outlandish because they did it with Hurricane Betsy in the 60s, and they did it in the 20s with the Great Mississippi Flood. And then there was also this construction of racial conflict going on that I'm sure is going on now, where you have this influx of Latino immigrants being horribly exploited. And White Mountain Apache, this is actually a White Mountain Apache native who, there was this us versus them between the black families that couldn't return and the Latinos and other people of color. It was an us versus them mentality that hadn't been in New Orleans before. And Katrina had created this conflict. So to say that race wasn't a part in any of this was infuriating, and this stance by the locals was ridiculous. So I came back, and I needed to do something, and this wasn't enough by any means, but I wanted to at least write this pain and anger out of me, and I wanted to sort of explain why polls showed up like this, where breaking up in between income brackets, there's still a racial disparity. So the first part of my section of my paper, which is called the Salience of Race in the Context of Katrina, is about how de jure, de facto residential segregation, including redlining, current now, ongoing discrimination in mortgage lending, restrictive covenants, ordinances, created this racial geography where that African Americans were living in the most flood-prone, vulnerable areas of the city. And were the most vulnerable in terms of disparities in wealth and their ability to rebound. So that's the first section. The second section of the paper is about this sort of national schema that we have about African Americans, and I mean schema, I mean implicit bias, unconscious racism, where we think of blacks as uneducated, violent, crime-prone, unstable, uncooperative people, and that schema I think influenced the disaster response, where it turned into more like a military occupation as opposed to a rescue effort, where we were focused more on rapes and murders and looting that did or did not occur. And I feel like this slide aptly demonstrates that schema. And so the headline is, "As Life Returns to New Orleans, So Does Crime," and that's a New York Times headline. And it's about the uptick in crime as people return. And also with the article is this picture of a group of men and women playing dominoes, a group of black men and women playing dominoes. They're not written about in the article specifically, and they're not criminals, they're just playing dominoes. But yet, if you look at this headline and you look at this picture, it shows how we equate crime with color. So that's the second section of the paper. The third section is about how the policies in the wake of the storm were disproportionately impacting communities of color. And one example is the decision not to reopen public housing, even though they were livable and repairable, much easier than most of the housing in the city. And so this is a picture of some public housing complex with steel grates over the windows so that residents couldn't even get in and get their stuff. They couldn't move back in if they wanted to. So these public housing complexes are 98 to 99% black. So to close that is to close an avenue of return for a large population, a large community in the city. So that's the paper. We were asked, the CRS program, to, through the slides. We were asked to attend the American Bar Association Council on Racial and Ethnic Justice last fall, and I'm out of time. I presented the paper. It was an intervention. It was confrontational. It was intense. They were fully believers in the class not race theory, but I think it was somewhat of a successful intervention. We all had our moments where we talked about how race mattered. Some people asked me for my copies of my paper, including the in-house counsel for Walmart. Somebody came opposite Walmart has a copy of my paper, but it was an intense, valuable, much needed experience for all of us, I think. Thanks.
So our next speaker is Marion Griffin. She's a Lebanese American in her second year at the law school. She enrolled in the CRS program to pursue her interest in studying the legal and social processes of racialization, and in particular the elision of many different identities under the rubric of the, quote, Arab Muslim other, unquote. She is currently working on an independent research project for which she has constructed an undergraduate course on racialization and the U.S. War on Terror, and will plan a colloquium on the same subject to take place at the law school.
Hi. Okay. So I think Vivek asked the question at the beginning of this panel how each of us made CRS our own. And I kind of want to talk about my independent projects to bring out the answer to that question, but also to bring out how the CRS program allowed me to make it my own. So basically, through these independent projects, I was able to explore ideas that are important to me and to extend the theories that I've learned to these issues, and also to acquire practical skills, so it's not just like a theoretical academic world. So because in CRS we're always told to ground our theoretical analysis in personal narrative, I'll just say a few things about how it is that I personally got involved in this topic. So as Vivek said, I'm Lebanese American. My mom is from Lebanon, and that's a country in a region where national and religious differences are very salient. And so, you know, I grew up in a household where, you know, Christian versus Muslim, that's an important distinction. The different nationalities from the Middle East are important distinctions. But then my experience with people outside my family told a different story completely. I remember once I had a Pakistani math study partner, and I was young and I didn't realize that, you know, there was some difference between, you know, Arab and South Asian communities, and so, you know, I turned to him thinking, oh, we're both Arab, and I made a comment to that extent, and he turned to me in disgust and said, Pakistanis are not Arabs. So, you know, that was sort of an interesting contrast between the ways in which these communities distinguish themselves from each other and the way in which these communities are also viewed socially as the same. An example of that is I also encountered someone, a friend of my cousin's, who made a comment about a roommate of his who is an Egyptian Copt, and he referred to him as a towel head. So this was also another interesting instance where, you know, he's referring to religious garb that maybe isn't necessarily worn by Copts, but, you know, to him that distinction doesn't matter. So it was interesting. So actually, you can also even see this in popular culture right now. I don't know if any of you have seen the TV show Lost, but there's a character, an Iraqi character named Saeed, who is played by a South Asian actor. So this is the kind of conflation that goes on. So that's the thing. These are the dynamics that led me to be interested in the racialization of Arabs and Muslims as a unitary monolithic group, and then the accrual of social meanings to this monolithic group. So, and all of this in response to the War on Terror. So I approached Saul Sarabia, who's the program director, with these interests, and he suggested that I make an independent project to explore these issues. And as part of that independent project, I was to write my CRS paper, so I got that requirement out of the way. Actually, I'm working on that requirement right now. And he also suggested that it would be useful to put together a class on this issue to either take place at the law school or at the undergraduate level. So let's see. All right, so I found out about an opportunity to create a course, and it's called the Collegium University Teaching Fellows. And basically what happens is you put together all sorts of things that you need to teach a course. You put together a syllabus, a required reading list, you put together a list of objectives. So I have my syllabus up here, which I put together over this semester with Saul's help. And again, you know, the CRS faculty is so interested in mentoring and encouraging students to do this kind of work that I had really invaluable help from Saul. And so I put together the syllabus and all those other things that I was talking about. How do I get to the other? All right. Yeah, so this is what it looks like. And this process was really useful to me. I'm interested in becoming a professor, and so just the process of trying to put together a course to sort of determine, you know, an overall idea and then what different objectives I want to reach through my course. The objectives are here, and then also I was asked to plan different activities, things like that. So I was able to acquire these practical skills. And then above and beyond this is going to be an undergraduate course, hopefully. And beyond that, we're also interested in putting together a colloquium here at the law school so that we attract scholars who are writing on this issue to the law school. And then we'll have like a series of panels dealing with different sub-issues of this topic. And then finally, I'm hoping by the end of the semester to have put together a database of relevant scholarship on this so that, you know, there will be the resources here on the website, you know, on campus for other law students and other people in the university to be able to do their own work in this field. So that's it.
So our next speaker is Nishan Neal. He's been a part of the UCLA campus since 2000. In 2004, he completed his BA in political science with a dual minor in public policy and African American studies. He's currently a second-year law student with a specialization in critical race studies. His academic and civic interest is the educational attainment of African Americans. As a professional undergraduate student, Nishan's been involved in many facets of campus life. He was chair of the African Student Union at UCLA, peer counselor for the Academic Supports Program, president of the National Pan-Hellenic Council, founding organizer of the University of California African Black Coalition, a UC system-wide organization for students of African descent, and a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. Finally, he's a part of the Emerging Critical Race Studies Global Affirmative Action Praxis Project at UCLA School of Law, and he'll be on the panel, which is later on today at 3:15, for the Affirmative Action Praxis Project. And he's from Carson, California.
Hello, everyone. As mentioned about, we tell a little bit of story about myself. When I entered UCLA in 2000, I was a part of a class of 250 African American students, and of that 250, only 50 of them were African American men. And in that same vein, there was an organizing space of concerned undergraduate students, a part of the African Student Union, who wanted to tell us about the story of Proposition 209 and the effects it had on our community and all communities of color, in particular African population. And that point, during that year at UCLA, the students were able to rally and repeal one of the institutional markers that created the elimination of affirmative action, which was Standing Policy 1, which eliminated the race in admissions and hiring. And that moment changed my life as a student. When I came into UCLA, parents are always told, just go to class, worry about getting a good job, don't go to do X, Y, and Z. My dad would always tell me, don't just become this African student that you just go to all the Black Power meetings and then you disengage and you don't graduate. This typical 70s story of what the typical black student activist would and never graduate. And I actually went against almost all the grain of my father's saying, but I did graduate, so that was one of the things there, and get to law school. But that moment for me shaped my life as a student at UCLA. So when I chose to go to UCLA Law School, or choose to go to law school, I was really concerned about how do you maintain that. And within the first semester of law school, there are several things that happened that challenged my thoughts. First is, first 1L year, as all 1L students that are in the room right now, you don't have time for a lot of different things outside of towards criminal law, lawyering skills, and all the other 4 classes that you may have. But one thing that happened was in the library while I was studying for torts, I looked at the CNN newscast and I talked about, it said Hurricane Katrina, and then I was wondering, like, it showed a picture of one of the images of all these African people out on the streets. And what was weird is that one time I realized within 3 or 4 weeks of my law school experience, I was disconnected from the entire world and the concerns and problems. And I think CRS has played a pivotal role about being that space to ground you, to remind you can be connected to reality. And Hurricane Katrina was one activity. The second activity was my own existence at UCLA Law School. I was a part of a class of 320 where there was one African American female. She's in the back right there, and Alina Abal. But that also showed that there was a problem. There's still a problem of the educational attainment of African people, and the university and the state's lack of concern about the policies that they institute that is a result of the problem. And I was wondering, how do you deal with these things? Towards criminal law, you'll hear someone say, well, black people are more criminal. I'm still challenging more criminal. That's why they deserve that result. And you're hearing all these things and you're wondering, how do you deal with this? How can someone tell you only worry about towards criminal law, contract civil procedure, and not worry about the current reality of your people? And that's one thing that I feel that CRS has provided for me, to be an avenue to be able to be concerned about your people and all of humanity, as well as your academic spaces. And things that I thought about in my 1L experience was Shared JD, a group of 2L and 3L students created the Students Helping Assure Racial Equality, Equity, Justice, and Diversity. And it was a student organizing space, something that's not typical in a law school space, where you have people taking organizing space against the administration, against policies that terrorize students of color, and policies that terrorize students of color from a lack of inaction when there's a racist problem that comes out on the campus, or if there's something in your student mailboxes, how it goes unannounced. And CRS students and faculty members provide that mentorship in that space for you to be able to navigate that. So as you're finding, it's okay to talk about it, but then there's also readings that you can be able to find a way to back that argument. And this year I've found a lot of ways to actually use CRS in my own practical life as being an organizer for Shared JD, as well as the Black Law Student Association. And I'll tell a story about the University of California has a study group. It's called the University System-wide, UC-wide Study Group on Diversity. And it's about 25 people, majority faculty and administrators of the university. And I'm, along with 6 other students, I'm the only African American student on the panel. But one thing a lot was always articulated was the concern of international student diversity as a part of the problem. And every time they brought that up, it was more of a defense of, we don't need to be concerned about African American students, Chicano students in California. And I was always faced, how do you deal with that argument? And I thought about my class in civil rights, and not civil rights, but critical race theory, where we talked about the role of immigrants, in diversity, and how does that work? What are the exchanges? And I just thought about those conversations that we had in class, and I was able to use those to say, we need to think critically about the way we're framing this discussion about international diversity versus national diversity, and reminding us that the reason why this committee was formed was actually a response to Proposition 209. If you look at the numbers, after implementation of Proposition 209, domestic student of colors, students in California have dropped. The concern about international students are a lot of different concerns that this study group is not a part of, and tried to talk about these things, and also provided articles to give people, not just having this law student think he knows everything, but actually articles that they actually can be able to look at to say, okay, I never did think about it. Oh, that's a good point, and I think that played a critical role in facilitating decision-making bodies. And another thought was actually, along with Claudia and a lot of other students, was shared JD, is actually thinking about how can we as 2Ls and use this critical race studies program to be an avenue to facilitate change. How can we use November 2nd, the day that the 10-year anniversary of Proposition 209, as a way to shake up our own campus, our own law school? And we just created a walk-in. So you have a student of color walk-in, where you gathered students of color from across the campus, and all students in particular, to come and sit in the classrooms to witness the injustices that were going on. And that was a powerful statement for the law school, but it realized to tell the story to everyone else. People of color felt affirmed in that space because they saw a lot of people caring about their concerns, and also understanding what it means to be the only Latino, the only Chicano, the only African person in a law school class where they could talk about race, or even the only person that identifies as Middle Eastern, how that affects when they talk about the war on terrorism and the national security, when a professor says, oh, you come into a group like a paramilitary group. So it's a lot of different things, but as my time is wrapping up, I just wanted to reiterate the point of CRS being a complete space to affirm the student, and which has affirmed me as being able to think about how do you navigate between the legal education, the rigors of a legal education, and actual community concerns. No problem.
So our next speaker is Esther Rowe. She's a 3L here at the law school. Prior to law school, she worked in private equity, and she helped establish the Korean American Coalition in San Francisco, and most recently served on the Los Angeles board of the Korean American Coalition. At UCLA, she is specializing in critical race studies. She's currently researching how to expand the legal rights of private home healthcare aides in California. She's interned with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and will be starting as a litigation associate at Squire, Sanders, and Dempsey in the fall.
Hi everyone. I'm very excited to be here today because I want to share with all of you something that I think is very amazing that's going on at UCLA right now. And that is the first year curriculum. So just to sort of set the background, as Vivek was mentioning earlier, what happens in the CRS program, it's really heavy in the second and third years, but in the first year there's really no set curriculum for first year students. And basically what we've recognized is there's lots of issues in the first year, and those of you who are either in law school now or have been in law school, you know that the first year is really the most difficult, both emotionally and even in some ways intellectually, because you're being introduced to, I guess, this new language, this new way of thought. And so one of our concerns in the CRS program has been that there is not enough intervention taking place in the first year curriculum, because I have a couple, oh, maybe I don't have a couple things. Right. Because there's, what happens is that there's kind of a delayed involvement for first year CRS students, so they don't get any information or tools or knowledge or anything like that to kind of help them in the first year classroom, which we find is a very difficult sort of environment. So I guess just these are some of the issues that we kind of saw in the first year. Okay. So to deal with this problem that we saw, what we wanted to do was create a first year curriculum. And there's multiple parts to it, but the part that I really want to talk about is the 1L workshops. So what we've done is we've created a set of readings and a curriculum for first year students so that CRS students can be involved much earlier on in their careers. And what we do in the first semester is really just skills-based type workshops and just an introduction to the critical race studies program so that they have a better understanding of what it is and how it's going to figure into their second and third years. And then in the second semester, we really focus on all the first year classes, but we provide basically an alternative pedagogical framework that they can use to think about the ideas that are being talked about in their first year. One of the problems about the first year curriculum, I think this is at all law schools, is that race is often omitted. It's either ignored or it's diminished, you know, so it's one or the other. And so even when students bring up questions like, oh, well, in that case, you know, weren't the case I'm thinking of is Williams, State v. Williams, which is a crim law case, and it's where parents were basically held for like negligence in terms of their child dying of an abscessed tooth. And so, but what was going on in the background there was that these, the mother especially was afraid of like the Indian Welfare Child Act, so she was afraid that like social services was going to come and take her child away if she took her child in for like medical services or something. And so that what I consider to be a very important fact is left out, right, when you talk about this case in the first year. And I think for a lot of students who do think about race and who do kind of have this other information, they do wonder, like in the first year classroom, why is this not being addressed? Or if I bring it up, why is the professor basically saying, oh, that's not a big deal, or oh, that's, you know, that's irrelevant to what we're talking about here. This case is about the doctrine. It's about negligence standard. That's all we're going to talk about. And so that can be very frustrating. And so in the second semester, what we try to do is weave in how CRT, how critical race theory addresses all the first year classes. And there are certainly some classes like con law and crim law that I think race is so evident, if you don't see it, you're blind because you can't miss it. It's there and it's in your face. But there are other classes like contracts or civil procedure, lawyering skills, legal writing, where I think that race may be slightly less obvious. And what we want to be able to do is help students see how race is playing a role in like the doctrine that they study. So in the second semester, that's what we do. And what we, I won't talk so much about the format, but what we do try to do is bring different CRS faculty in to present to the students and to engage them in a dialogue and create a safe space for them. Okay. So the objectives, and I mean, this is the first year that we've officially launched this program, so it's still in its infancy. But in terms of the objectives that we're trying to accomplish, first is like building the CRS community amongst the 1Ls, but also across all the classes. And really the arming the 1Ls with knowledge and tools, skills, that is to me very, very important, because whether or not you take the knowledge that we give you in these workshops and you actually speak up in class and you try to have that little intervention in the classroom, even if you don't do that, at least if you're sitting in class and you have this extra knowledge, you know to yourself, oh, you know, this is like, you know, bullshit, right? I mean, like this is, I know something else here, but I may not feel comfortable to say something, but that's okay because it gives students peace of mind, you know, to know that they're not crazy. Like if they feel that they're seeing something in a case or something, they don't feel like, oh, it's just me. There's something like maybe I'm being too sensitive or I'm reading into this, and that's what we try to tell students, that's not the case. You are seeing something that's very real. And then the other, like creating the safe space is also very important, we feel, for first year students, where they have a space to dialogue about these, you know, if they have questions, and to be able to talk about it. And, so just a couple things for upcoming is what we're trying to do is, well, obviously shorten the readings. That's more practical, just to make it more feasible for first-year students to participate. And then also formalizing it for first-year students and trying to get second- and third-year students more involved. So it can be also a pedagogical tool for upperclassmen who've taken these classes, and they can actually teach first-year students about the things that they've learned. And I think one of the other things that we are interested in doing is spreading this program to other law schools. So if there are students from other law schools where this type of program is currently missing, and they would like to talk about kind of how to pull together this kind of project and working with people at UCLA in the Critical Race Studies program, I'd be very happy to talk to anybody who has that sort of interest. And yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you.
speaker is Beth Rubé. She's a second-year student and is one of the founders of the Disability Studies Reading Group. And the two handouts that are on either side over here and here, and hopefully people have picked those up, and those are for her presentation.
Okay. Thank you. It's great to be connected to the symposium and an honor to be included with this group of panelists who are obviously all doing incredibly wonderful work. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Disability Studies Reading Group, or from my own experience in helping to create it within the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law. Although I'm one of 8 students who has been part of this sort of founding venture, including Claudia. So I am going to try to talk a little bit about the context of the group's inception, why it was important for me as a person living with multiple disabilities, and something about what the group has been working to create in terms of a race-conscious and disability-conscious kind of critical approach. One of the reasons I think we wanted to create an academic space within the law school to deal with disability is because although disability law is supposed to be part of the legal curriculum, it has not been at UCLA Law recently, or during the time any of our second-year students have been here, and we're not sure whether it'll be offered next year either. So one reason was just that we had to create our own education in this area because it hasn't been happening. But there was sort of a more, I think, pressing issue, which is that the law school climate for students with disabilities is extremely painfully hostile. There's been kind of ongoing controversy about whether people should have disability accommodations, whether people are faking disabilities in order to get unfair advantages on their tests. And so the law student population of roughly 1,000 people has maybe 8%. I think there are roughly 80 registered students with disabilities, as well as some who are not registering just because the climate is so hostile and they'd rather wade through without it. But most of those folks have, like me, hidden disabilities. You can't spot us by looking, and so the climate for the kind of couple of people who are identified by wheelchairs or by obvious visual disability is hostile, and for everybody else it's sort of like you don't look disabled, which is kind of a broader social problem, certainly not invented by the law school, but is intensified in this environment because law students are sort of so crazy, and I say that not in the positive psychiatric disability way, but in the sense of having a kind of competitive anxiety and being all panicked about where we're ranked and how are we doing, and so there's this scrutinizing of your peers that gets very ugly around disability and means that most students with hidden disabilities are really hiding. It's not simply that it's not obvious, it's that we're hidden by the law school because we're unacknowledged, we're hiding ourselves because it's a hostile environment, and when we try to talk about disability in the law school context, people say just the most outrageous things, like, well, how are you going to get a job? Or how can you practice law if you can't read, if you can't read without adaptive equipment? So just, sort of a host of problems in that regard, and it's also exacerbated by the fact that the UC system as a whole, and UCLA specifically, are really not ADA compliant in quite a number of areas, meaning are not complying with the terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, both architecturally and relative to the sorts of services and accommodations students are supposed to be getting. We've had students, for instance, we recently had one of the critical race studies students who had an injury that was preventing her from being able to type, and instead of working out an accommodations plan, the Office for Students with Disabilities suggested that she should just go ahead and withdraw for this semester, which is so outrageous and inappropriate and unlawful, and yet routine, unfortunately, not a unique story. And so the kind of fight to get very basic accommodations combined with the hostile climate, which prevents you from telling most of your peers what's happening, was really paramount. Christina Vargas did a wonderful job. Some of you heard her during the Student Practitioner Roundtable of talking about some of the intersections between race and disability. And some of those same issues guided us to particularly want to locate a disability studies curriculum within the Critical Race Studies program. A significant number of the students with hidden disabilities in the law school are also people of color. I would say roughly half, which is certainly more than I think of the representation of people of color in the law school at large. But there's really been a kind of silence from disabled students in general, but also in terms of anybody talking about disability and race together. And they're really salient. One of the things that we know is that the UCLA Law School has this academic support section for students who perform poorly in their first semester. And we've noted year after year that its composition has been composed of people with disabilities, people of color, or people who are both, especially people who are both. And that we can understand why that's happening partly in the context of a kind of hostile and alienating curriculum and partly in the context of a lack of accommodation. So there's a lot more I could say about climate, but I want to talk a little bit about how the group has developed. What we did basically was do a collective independent study. We had a lot of really wonderful support and enthusiasm from Saul Sarabia. And we compiled the group from CRS students, students with disabilities who had an interest in a critical race studies framework, some of our public interest program students. The group is mostly, but not entirely, composed of people with disabilities. And we put together this kind of course of study that would have us reading in a range of areas, but with some concentration this particular semester on education, and with a stronger concentration in the fall, because we do plan to continue, on criminal justice systems, and particularly disability in prisons. So I think in my last couple minutes, one of the things I'd like to do is say a little bit about the, or 1 minute, thank you. One of the things I'd like to say, to do is say a little bit about what I feel like the group has created. I mean, one, we've created an actual friendly community for people with disabilities in the law school. And I know Sol talked earlier today about sort of critical race studies as a place to build communities that support people being able to exist in institutional spaces like this and still be effective and take care of ourselves. So we do have this kind of like critical, intellectual, but also really vivacious and loud and angry and excited group of folks who are talking very deeply about white supremacy and capitalism and globalization and disability and the ways in which oppressions are disabling, for instance, looking at the ways in which communities as a whole become disabled, and then also dealing with these complex issues of difference and disability pride and, you know, the differences in types of disabilities. And I notice that I am at time, so I'll close by saying I did want to pass out our reading list and bibliographies because I can't begin to do justice to talking about the kinds of frameworks that we've created as a group, but I'm really feeling like we're bringing something that isn't present to most of the critical race studies discourse, and also bringing a dimension of analysis to disability studies that I think is still done too rarely. So I'm very proud and excited to be part of what the group has done. And if anybody needs the handouts in alternative formats, see me after. Okay.
So our next speaker is Claudia Pena. She's a 2L here at UCLA. And she's interested in critical race studies, international human rights, disability rights, sexual orientation law, and issues of educational equity. She's an activist at heart and plays a mean game of football.
No, that's football, soccer. So the last stretch, aren't you excited? I'm the last speaker. It's after lunch. I see that we have a little bit of low energy. So why doesn't everybody, if you're able, stretch, take a good nice yawn. Go ahead and open your mouth and do it. Panelists, stretch. It feels so good. Kind of like when you sneeze. It feels so good. So I just want to talk a couple minutes about making some connections. Many of the conversations that we have in the talks like we had at lunchtime, this one, probably in any of the classes that you're taking, because you're at the symposium, I'm going to assume conversations that you have with your friends. There are many civil rights movements that we have not yet won, right? And I would say all civil rights movements, but I don't want to be too negative. So the race war hasn't been won, the gender war, the disability war, all these things we're working towards relieving ourselves or getting freedom from oppression, and we haven't quite made it. And I would suggest that one of those reasons is that we haven't made the connections that are necessary in order to see the broader picture so that we can actually achieve what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, today, the connections that I noticed in the panel as I was listening, we had a teach-in recently about Palestine, and that after we had that teach-in, a Native American student came up to me and said, wow, our struggles are so similar in terms of looking for self-determination and having an indigenous group of people that is suffering colonization. So you can connect those issues really easily. And then when I heard Kelly and Miriam talking about Katrina and the war on terror, I remember when Katrina first hit and everybody started making these commentaries about how little the lives of the people in New Orleans were valued. Like if there was more white people that were middle or upper class, the country as a whole, the government would have made more of an effort to save those people, but they chose not to. And that's similar, I think, to the war on terror in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq. Those lives are also not valued. If we were having a war on terror here in the U.S., say Oklahoma, the U.S. government likely would not just start bombing Oklahoma as a whole in order to uproot all the terrorism. But that choice is easily made when we're talking about a nation such as Afghanistan or Iraq. In terms of what Nishan and Beth were talking about, affirmative action and disability, now that connection isn't as clear, is it? But it is. Affirmative action, one or two of the goals, it has many goals, is to integrate and to have access to educational equity and opportunity. Some of the similar things are going on within the disability community. Integration into not just education, but just space, period. The mall, movie theaters, anywhere and everywhere. Integration is one of the goals, and also access to equity and opportunity. So you can see very, very clearly how those connections are easily made, but not many of us are making them, at least not in scholarship or, in symposiums or in our conversations with our friends. And then in terms of what Esther was talking about, integrating CRS into the first year curriculum, that was almost completely student motivated, and it was students who decided that really sucked our first year. We did not like the way it went down, so we're going to do something about it. And that's what I think some of the students in this room right now are doing in terms of integrating CRS into your other disciplines. We had a meeting fairly recently, a couple months ago, with urban planning folks and public policy folks, and I forget. But the students were really excited about integrating CRS into their programs. It's students empowering themselves to do something about their own situation, which I think is really amazing and inspiring, and everybody should take note. So I just want to let you all know that those connections were the impetus for the symposium. We have a student named Negwa Ibrahim who is not here currently, but it was her idea to start a CRS journal in order to make all these connections, because it was her idea that we needed those connections to be made in order for it to be clear so that we can actually do something. And then from that journal idea, this symposium was born. So we're really excited to have you here. We hope that you continue to enjoy the rest of the things that we have planned. And I would encourage you to continue to make the connections, and not necessarily to become involved in every movement, right? Because we're one person, there's only 24 hours in the day, and there's just not enough energy. But I would encourage you to make the connections and become interested even in those movements in which you may not recognize that you're directly affected, though I assure you, you are. And take note of that and connect them to your own struggles and your own movements so that we can broaden the struggle together and hopefully end up doing something about it.
So now we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. So if anyone has any comments, questions, or anything for any of our panelists, please bring them forward. And if you would like to use the mics, there's one on each side.
I actually have a question. Hi, my name is Ila. I'm from France. I was born in Paris, grew up in France. My parents are Moroccan, so I'm Muslim Moroccan, living in France. Moved here about 5-6 years ago, and I'm interested in the critical race studies program. And I looked at the curriculum, and it mostly deals with domestic issues. And I was wondering, how can someone from an international background fit into, the CRS program and kind of like make those interconnections?
Can I go first?
You go first.
I'll tell you what our LLM students do. They insert themselves into the conversation by bringing up the ways in which the different things that we're talking about, the different struggles that we're talking about, are implemented or acknowledged or whatever in their own countries. which is really an amazing thing for us and a privilege and honor for us. But I bet that it's kind of a struggle for them, you know, because racialization in the U.S. is very, well, you can't say very, it's just unique. And I think that that ends up affecting their curriculum or their experience here at UCLA because we don't really broaden our conversation to the international level. We don't, and we're working on it. We're working on creating a bigger international human rights program. But I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a struggle, and the way they do it is they force themselves in, which is exactly what they should be doing.
And I'm a part of a class actually.
Oh,
well,
right.
In the fall, Professor Crenshaw created a class, actually a comparative law course where it compared France, the United States, South Africa, India, and Brazil, and the focus was race and gender conscious remedies and how each country facilitates equality for marginalized groups of people. And it's a part of a larger project in response to the Third World Conference on Racism, and the professor wanted to build that next step. How do we build the campaign? Interesting enough, you said you were from France, and we had a discussion about that and finding out the comparative space, because quite often when you do comparative law, most people have a warped view of the United States or their own country. So a lot of times we hear about the bad parts. When people say, oh, they call African American scholars imperialist, they said, oh, they have it's wrong, they're just imposing a structure on them, but what you end up finding out is what structure that they have of what United States discrimination looks like is stagnant around 1965, and even our own views of other countries are warped because we just don't know, and we sometimes take our own privilege to say this is the way it looks, and that's how racism works, or this is how sexism works in that context. But that's a budding space, and we'll be talking a little bit more about it at the next panel of the Global Affirmative Action Project.
As students, how do you guys plan to bring your critical race studies into your work as practitioners of law?
You can answer that better, Rachel.
I'm asking for my own benefit. Go ahead.
I'll say a little bit. I think I want to go into prisoners' rights. So this program has been so key to helping me acknowledge or learn or be aware of my own prejudices as a white person that's going to be working with communities of color. And it's given me an awareness of this sort of structural forces, institutional racism that's created these systems that are marginalizing people. And it's also been an incredible lesson in working alongside my allies in solidarity instead of sort of swooping in as some sort of savior. So it's been wonderful.
How do you begin to discuss like a certain topic like gender or race, race within gender and vice versa, when there's like so many intersectionalities? Like, how do you? So I'm writing a paper, I'm trying to conceptualize the notion of gender identity, and I couldn't ignore all the race issues within that. And it's like, how do you begin to write something or create something, a body of literature or work, to say something to some, a specific, say, gender, but not include everything else and become, I guess, watered down. But at the same time, you risk not, connecting the important issues. So how do you deal with that in your own work?
Oh, you're looking at me? Okay. You did good intersectionalities. Okay. I mean, I think the crux of that question is about how to do intersectionality in a meaningful way, and I think there is this anxiety about, especially when we think about higher education in general and law schools in particular, there's never enough attention to gender. There's never enough attention to race or any of these dynamics, disability, class, sexuality. And so there is this sense of wanting to hold that issue at the forefront. But the reality of the ways that we live is that our identities not just intersect, but interact and reinforce and construct each other. And so to really do powerful feminist scholarship or race-conscious or critical race studies scholarship, you in fact have to kind of get at the totality of the oppression to the extent that you can. And I think that sort of embracing that and just kind of letting it happen is really powerful, and there's scholars who do that so beautifully. In addition to Professor Crenshaw, like Letty Volpe, when I read her work and she's talking about the ways in which gender is racialized or race is gendered. And I'm just like, oh, that's, yes, the world, the way I'm experiencing or recognizing it. And so kind of embracing that and getting into the histories of gender and like understanding the way in which gender has been constructed in this country has been totally racialized. Like only just thinking about like where the word ladies comes from, right? You know, really starts to make that very clear. And so once we start to tease out those histories, we get that it's not either or, that they've always been so intertwined. And we can talk, I find going back into the history always really, really helpful in framing a more contemporary argument.
I could just add that it doesn't water down your argument. I think it makes it stronger to connect and make all of those things come to light.
My question is for Kelly. How did you get to a place where you come from, like Nebraska, you said, in Utah, to come out of your self as a white woman, to want to study what you study and to get to know people that is a different race as you? And the reason I'm asking the question, I'm in South Africa, and for years I didn't associate with non-blacks because of my apartheid experience. And it wasn't until going through the Truth Commission in my country that my eyes were open to the beauty that is within all of us as human beings. And I just want to know, when did you decide, or what got you to, because as human beings we are more comfortable around people that look like us. And it takes a great deal of courage, quite frankly, to step outside of who you are and to try and help and to get to know people that you have nothing physically in common with. And I want to know, when did you get to your place to do what you did?
Well, I still have a tremendously long way to go. I left Salt Lake City because it was just so homogenous, and there was nothing interesting to me, or well, I won't say that there wasn't anything unique, because there are things that are unique about Utah, but I wanted to put myself into something completely and totally different, and I don't know where that comes from, to be honest with you. And then working in places like a jail, where you're on one side of the bars, you're a white person on one side of the bars, and you're looking almost entirely at communities of color. To be an effective helper, which is what my position was, I needed to get to know the persons that I'm working with and talking with and trying to help. Otherwise, I won't be doing anything. And then once you start, I guess, I just wanted more. And psychologically, I don't know when it happened or where it came from. It's certainly been a process.
So actually, we've run out of time, but there's a break between now and 3:30, so feel free to come up and ask the panelists more questions. Join me again in thanking the panelists.
Nice tie-up, by the way. Appreciate it, Karen.